there, Unmaskers. Welcome to my channel, Unmask It Now. Thanks for tuning in today. In today's episode, we'll look into the steps to recover an EC2 Windows instance when its primary elastic network interface, or NIC on Windows, is disabled. Let's switch over to the AWS console. I've already launched a Windows Server EC2 instance. Every instance comes by default with a primary elastic network interface called as EC2. We can now take a look at this network interface by selecting the instance and switching over to the networking tab. Since this instance is launched in the default VPC's public subnet, the primary network interface has a public IPv4 address which corresponds to the private IPv4 address associated with that interface. Let's now switch over to the RDP session. I am currently logged into the same EC2 Windows instance over RDP using its public IP. As you would on any Windows machine, you can run ipconfig/all to display the IP configuration details on this instance from the command prompt. So let me proceed to run ipconfig/all. You can see that the primary network interface within the operating system is called as Ethernet 2. And you can also see the private IP address that is associated with that network interface. You can also run ncpa.cpl to list the network interfaces on this instance within the operating system. Considering we are logged into the instance using the public IPv4 address associated with the primary network interface, let's pause here for a bit and think of a situation when one accidentally disables the primary network interface from within the operating system. This would in turn prevent any network connectivity to the instance, and the RDP session would immediately disconnect. Let's simulate that situation and see what happens. I'll right-click on the Ethernet 2 interface and proceed to disable that interface. You will immediately notice that the instance becomes unresponsive and we receive a pop-up that the connection to the remote host is lost and the RDP session is attempting to reconnect. Since we know that the network interface is disabled, the reconnection isn't going to be successful unless we actually make amends to recover from this issue. Switching back to the AWS console, if I refresh the page, the status checks are still passing, and they haven't reported as a failure yet. In the background, Amazon EC2 would be attempting to run health checks against the instance periodically. Give it a few minutes and we will start to observe that the instance status checks would fail. I've given it a couple of minutes, and after a refresh, we now see that the status checks are reporting a 1x2 checks passed. Let's take a closer look at these status checks. To do so, select the instance and switch over to the status checks tab. The system status checks are passing, which is obvious since we have disabled the network interface from within the operating system. So technically, it is not an issue with the underlying hardware. However, it is expected for the instance status checks to fail with an instance reachability failure. This started about 2 minutes ago. Let's now look into how we can recover from this problem and gain access back to the instance. With Amazon EC2, you have the flexibility to attach and detach network interfaces to the instance. We will use that ability to recover the instance. To do so, we need to create a temporary network interface in the same subnet and attach it to the instance as a secondary interface. But before we do that, we need to make a note of two things: the security group ID associated with the primary network interface for this instance and the subnet ID in which this instance is launched. These two will then need to be provided when creating the secondary network interface. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. To get the security group ID, select the instance and switch over to the security tab and make a note of the security group ID. In my case, the security group ID ends with 12A. To make a note of the subnet ID, switch over to the networking tab and make a note of the subnet ID. In this case, it ends with 35A. Let's now go ahead and create a network interface. To do so, scroll down on the left navigation pane and click on the Network Interfaces tab. Let's click on Create a Network Interface. I'm going to provide a description to the network interface. Let me call it as a secondary interface. For the subnet, click on the drop-down and select the subnet in which the instance is launched. In my case, the subnet ends with 35A. For the private IPv4 address, I'm going to leave it as auto-assign. Since this is not an elastic fabric adapter, I'm going to uncheck that option. For the security group ID, select the same security group ID that was associated to the primary network interface. In my case, the security group ID ends with 12A. Let's now provide an optional tag. I'm going to provide the name tag for this interface. Once done, click on Create Network Interface to create the interface. If you are connecting to the instance from another instance in the same subnet or a different subnet but within the same VPC, you can stop here and attempt to connect to the instance using the secondary network interface's private IP. To get the private IP, select the secondary interface and scroll to the right until you find the primary private IPv4 address. However, in my case, I am connecting to the instance over the internet using the public IP. So I will need to take it a step further and associate an elastic IP address, which is a static public IPv4 address, to the secondary interface and then use that elastic IP to connect to the instance over RDP. To do so, scroll down on the left navigation pane and select elastic IPs. First, we need to allocate an elastic IP address, so click on Allocate Elastic IP Address. We will be allocating an elastic IP address from Amazon's pool of IPv4 address. Select that option and click on Allocate. Once you have received the public IPv4 address, select that elastic IP, click on Actions, and then click on Associate Elastic IPv4 Address. There are two methods to associate an elastic IPv4 address to a network interface. You can do so by selecting the resource type as an instance or the network interface. In this particular case, since our instance has two network interfaces, that does not seem appropriate. So let us click on the network interface and specifically select our secondary network interface. Select the private IP address and the private IPv4 address should appear for the dropdown for that secondary interface. Then click on Associate. Now we have associated an elastic IP to the secondary network interface. The next step is to attach the secondary interface to the instance. So let's scroll down and select the Network Interfaces tab. Select the secondary network interface, click on Actions, and then click on Attach. Make sure to select your instance from the dropdown and then click on Attach. Let us verify the attachment status. You can see that the attachment status is in use. Let's switch over to the Instances tab. Let us now refresh the page. Select the instance, click on the Networking tab and scroll down. You can now see that the instance has two network interfaces, the primary network interface and the secondary interface that we just attached. You can see that the secondary interface is associated with the elastic IP address and has a private IPv4 address associated with it. I am going to use the elastic IP address of the secondary network interface to now connect to the instance over RDP. So let's copy that elastic IPv4 address. Switch over to the remote desktop application and edit the configuration. I'm going to paste the elastic IPv4 address that I just copied and click on Save. Then try to connect to the instance. As you can see, it is prompting me for the username and password, which does not change, and you can connect using the same credentials as before. I'm going to decrypt the password from the console. And click on Continue to connect to the instance. We have now been able to successfully connect to the instance using the secondary network interface's elastic IP. As you can see, we can see that there are two network interfaces within the operating system. The one that is disabled was the primary network interface that we disabled earlier, and the other one which is enabled is the secondary network interface. To recover the instance, let's now try to enable the primary network interface back. So right-click on that and click on Enable. Once the primary network interface is successfully enabled, let's now try to connect back to the instance using the primary network interface. So switching over to the AWS console, I'm going to select the instance and make a note of the public IP of the primary network interface and use that to connect to the instance. So let's disconnect from this RDP session. Copy the primary public IPv4 address and then try to connect back to the instance. Before that, disconnect from the previous session. We can paste the same credentials as before. Let me copy the password. And paste it back and click on Continue. So we have now connected successfully using the primary network interface's public IPv4 address. Now it is safe to disable the secondary interface and detach it from the instance. Switch back to the AWS console. Click on the instance. Click on the networking tab and select the secondary network interface. Select the interface, click on Actions, and then click on Detach. Verify the status of attachment for the interface. Once the network status attachment is available, it is now safe to delete this network interface. Select the instance, click on Actions, and then proceed to delete the network interface. We have now successfully deleted the temporary network interface that we created to recover the instance when its primary network interface was disabled. Thanks for watching. For more such content, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Unmask It Now. Until next time.